Professor Nobes, thank you for coming. And please, the Foundation like to answer some questions I am going to do. For example, which means the adoption of IFRS in the European Union for the companies?
Do you mean what is the result, or how difficult is it?
Well, perhaps not. Which is the reason that the authorities thought that it is better to use a common language for all the different companies quoted in the different markets of the European Union?
Okay, that's a good question. So, the idea that there should be common accounting has been with us for a long time in Europe. So we started with the idea of trying to harmonise all the laws, because the European Union naturally tries to work through laws. And this process began in the 1970s. So we had a series of what are called directives, which then are sent to Madrid and London and Paris to be turned into laws. And this was designed to harmonise accounting for several reasons. I think perhaps Europe had the idea of taxation as well in the back of its mind. Harmonised accounting might help with harmonised taxation. And of course there's a general process to try to harmonise nearly everything in Europe, the colour of passports and so on. So accounting became part of that process. For listed companies, of course, there's a much better reason, which is that increasingly the lenders and the shareholders might very well be international. So a French bank might buy shares in a British company, and a German person might buy shares in a Spanish company. So that means that it's really useful to have accounting that's done in a similar way. By the end of the 1990s, the Commission in Brussels realised that its process was not really working, the process of using law, partly because in order to get the laws agreed, so many options had to be inserted and so many difficult areas had to be omitted that the resulting laws had gaps in them and enabled too much flexibility. So that legal process did not really achieve common accounting. And so they realised that they'd have to do something else, particularly for listed companies where it's really important. They could, of course, have forced everyone to adopt American accounting, but we suppose that would be not very popular, especially in Paris, for example. Or they could have perhaps tried to invent a wholly new system of European accounting, but many countries were opposed to that. And in the end, the only obvious choice is international standards. And the board that was writing international standards was very European, not wholly European, but there were lots of European input and countries on it. So in 2000 onwards, it became clear that this was the way forward. We'll sort of merge the process. That is, we'll use international standards and insert them into the European legal system. And I think this has worked in that if you compare, for example, Spanish, German and British accounting now compared to 10 years ago, they are much more similar, and it's much easier for investors and others to compare companies across Europe.
Mm-hmm. That means that there is no difference between accounting in UK, in Spain, in France, and in other European countries, or remains some of them?
Well, yes, of course, and that is part of tonight's issue. First, of course, your question to start with was about particularly listed companies, and so international standards are only compulsory for the consolidated statements of listed companies. The accounting going on in all the other companies, which is 90-something% of companies, does not need to use IFRS, so that remains different. So all German companies are using German accounting except for consolidated statements. And most British companies, although they could use international standards, are still using British standards for their unconsolidated statements. So a huge proportion of the financial statements in Europe are still prepared under national rules. But even if we concentrate only on consolidated statements of listed companies, where everyone is supposed to be using IFRS, we find there are a lot of choices inside IFRS. Some of the choices are deliberate, some are not deliberate because they involve estimating numbers, which can be done differently by different accountants. And the result of this is that there's still a lot of opportunity for Spanish accounting to be different from British accounting, and that is the central issue that we'll be examining tonight.
Uh-huh. But I understand that for European global players, perhaps it's much better because the investors understand better than years before the financial reporting.
Yes. So if we ask, has the adoption of international standards achieved something for large listed companies? The answer is yes. Accounting is much more similar than it was before IFRS was adopted. But if we ask, can we still see the difference between Spanish IFRS and British IFRS, even for very large companies, the answer is yes, we can see the difference.
Including, for example, this can happen with a company like Banco Santander. It's different Banco Santander UK than Banco Santander in Spain applying the same accounting standards?
Well, of course, there are some companies called Banco Santander in the UK, but they are subsidiaries and they are doing UK accounting rules. If we compare Banco Santander with Barclays Bank in their consolidated financial statements, both using IFRS, we will find them doing different accounting, making different choices. So, to take a simple example, many banks own lots of buildings and land, so a Dutch bank like ING will value all their buildings and land at today's market prices, not just their investment property land that they rent out, but their head office and their bank branches. A British bank will revalue the investment properties, the ones, and it has many, but its head office and its bank branches will be at cost. A Spanish bank will value everything at cost. So 3 different banks in the EU, all using IFRS, and for their most important assets, perhaps in many cases, they're using 3 different approaches to measuring. Okay,
I am sure that the job of accountants continues for many years, for a long time.
Yes, of course, possibly for investors and auditors, it might be annoying that all this variety exists, but for academic accountants, it makes life much more interesting.
Thank you very much.